Today, we're diving into a topic that every leader and organization is going to have to face head on over the next decade, whether they're ready to or not. The aging workforce, longer careers, and what Dan Pontefract calls age debt. Dan's new book, The Future of Work is Gray, or maybe I should say The Future of Work is Gold, isn't just that you've made it to side B. It's one of the most thoughtful, well researched explorations I've seen on how age, experience, and longevity are reshaping work. He connects big demographic trends to very human stories and practical frameworks. In today's conversation, we're going to explore what age debt actually is, why he believes ageism is the last socially acceptable ism, and how leaders can turn the aging workforce from a looming liability into what he calls the experience dividend. Welcome to the Good Leadership Podcast. I'm Charles Good. This show is built for leaders, managers, and high achievers who want to think better, grow faster, and perform under pressure. Each episode, I sit down with leading researchers, best-selling authors, and experts to uncover what actually works, the practical tools, proven strategies, and insights you can use when the pressure is real. Because in a world that keeps changing, the edge belongs to those who can outlearn what worked yesterday, outthink what's coming next, and outperform when it counts. Welcome to the program, Dan.
Charles, that was a wonderful introduction. Thank you for having me. I hope we get into some age against the machine dialogue today as well. Yes.
I love it. Well, let me start with the way that you designed this whole book, which I think is quite unique because the structure itself is a signal to the reader. You structured this book as a vinyl record. Side A as a hard age debt wake-up call, and side B as a hopeful experience dividend. So for leaders just meeting you through this conversation, what is the core problem that you're trying to wake them up to? And maybe what's that new possibility you're inviting them into?
Well, first, Charles, I guess I'm a wannabe or long-suffering DJ, hence the idea of writing a book that didn't even have chapters. They're called tracks. And as you say, there's two sides. You know, any good album, I suppose, has like 10 good tracks. And in this case, side A, the first 5 tracks of this album is really the wake-up call that it's a mea culpa for me as well. So let me explain. So I am a recovering human resources, people and culture executive. I spent 20 years at SAP and TELUS, big telecom in Canada, in the HR space, leading leadership development, leading culture change, et cetera. Charles, I realized that in my early 40s, when I was no longer a PNC executive, that when I was in my 30s and 40s, I never thought about age. And when I mean I never thought about age, that meant when I'm working with these leaders and building cultures and so forth, age never came into my mind. And with that, that's terrible because there are leaders today, whatever their age and certain roles across organizations that aren't thinking about age either. And so long story short, I wanted to dig into something that I completely missed and was naive and had a cognitive bias to sort of say, well, if I were to do it again in my 30s and 40s as a leader doing leadership development, culture change, et cetera, I should probably pay more attention to it because the issues of today in 2026 are certainly, from an age perspective, far graver than back then. But I still wanted to sort of write a book and do the research that suggests there's a playbook ahead that you need to pay attention to.
And what I love about the structure too is that side A almost feels like a Dylan protest album, right? It's uncomfortable, it's noisy, it's necessary. And side B feels more like that side where we start to hear solutions and harmony again.
And first of all, thank you. This wannabe DJ thought, yeah, let's make it raunchy, like a Dylan protest side, if you will. You're right. It's spot on. And those kind of tracks all relate around to 4 pretty big issues. I mean, the opening track is just setting the stage, but then tracks 2, 3, 4, 5, before you flip over, really are 4 compelling, united forces that create age debt. And so maybe we'll get into these, but just quickly, there's I kind of call it a demographic apocalypse. There's this demographic tidal wave, a demographic disruption, a change that I don't know why, but me included, we aren't paying attention to. And the bottom line is that there are fewer young people because of fewer babies being produced, fewer immigrants coming into countries like Canada and the US. There's a demographic change that's happening as a result, and that's going to impact and is impacting the workforce. So it's like, okay, So demographic change. Number two, with that, there's this sort of longevity kind of unawareness, I guess I'll call it. And this kind of pressure point of longevity is from a human perspective, a lot of us aren't realizing as well that we're going to live longer. So whether it's financial strain, the personal burdens, kind of this societal inertia that we sit in, these organizational gaps, there's this longevity problem, I would say, or whatever pressure point. And then two others quickly, what I call the experience conundrum. So, for example, big tech in 2026 in America have rid themselves of about 145,000 jobs. And when you start digging into some of those and you're thinking, well, what's the age spectrum? There's a propensity for these organizations to involuntarily terminate older workers as opposed to young and middle age. Now, that being said, what are we doing in the organizations when it comes to experience? So, i.e., are we capturing it? We just let it walk out the door. And is anyone doing any of that sort of post analysis like, oh, anyone know about Jimmy's customers and what they like during the holiday season? Or when's their renewal? Like, Jimmy had 15 years working with that client. Does anyone know where Jimmy is now? Can anyone call Jimmy? So this again idea of experience and the conundrum that we are losing out in capturing it, let alone transferring and sharing it within the organization. So that's number three. And then it doesn't get any better because the last of the isms is still rampant and pervasive and consistent in our orgs, and that is ageism. And we just don't seem to be very kind to one another. Whether you're a young worker, an older worker sort of making fun of their inability to use a wall clock, and we'll make fun of that, or calling them the young kids, or ourselves if you're middle age or older and saying I just had a senior moment, or hey boomer, or these just crazy generational terms. So long story short, ageism is rampant. That's the fourth one. The third one, of course, is the experience conundrum. And then numbers two and number one are kind of related but different: longevity issues and not paying attention to living longer, and the pay scales and the savings, and then the demographic apocalypse. So how's that for a dark, raunchy, heavy metal Dylan protest side?
That fits it very well, Dan. Now, you define age debt, and I'm taking this from the book, the organizational failure to plan for and value age, resulting in capability loss and a weakened workforce. In broad terms, you mentioned some of those factors that cumulative burden of organizations face as populations age, birth rates plummet, and internal skill gaps widen. Plus, these multi generational issues are growing. I've had other guests on the podcast that talk that for the first time ever, we've have five generations in the workforce working together, trying to make this work. And I love how you bring in the data to really support your findings here, because you give projections from Canada, from the US, from Europe, Japan, which we'll get into, South Korea, that shows this isn't hypothetical. Aging populations and shrinking cohorts of young workers will hit every sector. The only question is whether leaders acknowledge age debt now or get overwhelmed later. Because I hear this a lot from when I talk to leaders and CEOs. Where does age debt show up on my dashboard, Charles? It's not a single KPI. It's more of a pattern, I think, a slower innovation where you have fewer ready successors, more burnout mid-career, but it doesn't really show up on the dashboard. Or do you agree with that? Or what would you tell a CEO that says, hey, yeah, I get it, but I need to see it for myself, and where does it show up?
Couldn't agree more. It is not on the minds or radars of CEOs or boards, for that matter. And sort of the analogy or even the metaphor, perhaps I use in the book, is when a fire swept through Lahaina or the fire swept through California, in the Los Angeles region in 2025. When my province, where I live in Canada, British Columbia, literally catches fire every May and continues through to about September, we're waking up, I suppose, to the climate crisis. And that has become an issue for many CEOs who have workers, in this case of California, or being dislodged from a home that they used to live in. And now, how do we help them? From customers and clients and issues, et cetera, because of climate change. So it's like, oh, so now climate change has been something we should be thinking about. How do we protect our data center from catching on fire? Because we put that in the middle of Kamloops in British Columbia, for example, where there's tons of fires. So it becomes an issue because all of a sudden now there's a threat. When we think about what you might call the climate age crisis, it's not a threat because it hasn't reached the board of governors, boards, the C-suite, the CEO yet from a "oh, my house is on fire" perspective. And I think that is what I'm trying to sort of ring the bell on, if you will. And so there's a couple things that demarcate from this. Who's guilty? Well, let's just take a step back and say, okay, boards, you have an HR file, and that HR file includes usually succession plan for the CEO. It also usually includes some sort of exhibit or analysis, right? And so within that talent exhibit and analysis, my question for you, the board member, is why aren't you asking the question about demography? Now, that is a North America thing that it's not on the list. But when you start peeling back the onion of this age file, age debt in Europe and Asia, they actually do now. Many of those companies and boards have it as a file. So, for example, like when BMW decided to do an age audit in their Germany facilities, they recognized that they had a high portion of their workers who were over the age of 50, and they hadn't really thought about that before. DB, Deutsche Bahn, is a cargo transport company also in Germany, did an age audit. And they realized that 55% of their 19,000 people were over the age of 50. And so all of a sudden now age has become a file in the sort of talent file. And now it's like, oh, wait a second, this is math. So now you can see where I'm going with this, right? As soon as you see data, and that data can be things like an age audit, or then it can be, huh, where's our revenue coming from? So if it's a consumer good or et cetera, like a company can say, man, our demographics are changing. Like, and then it starts to hit. So the penny drops. So I would say, first and foremost, long-windedly, sorry, Charles, that boards are culpable if they're not thinking about demography right now. And then, ergo, if that's not at the board level, it's never going to be at the C suite level because the CEO is sort of not thinking about that either. So there is a culpable factor here, a culpability factor with the CEO who really should be saying, huh, like, I mean, I might not be here forever. But if I am just thinking kind of like short termism thinking, like it's just for the next quarter, I'm not worried about the next 3 to 5 years, Charles, then that's that you're sort of abdicating fiduciary responsibility for where this organization should be or could be in a few years. And then thirdly, I would paint some blame at the CHROs out there. So if you're a chief human resources officer, a chief people officer, and you don't have an age file within your talent matrix and asking the questions about demography, then you are setting yourself up for a huge void, a huge, ringing of the bell to come that will silently and painfully bite you in the very near future. So, summary: boards are culpable. CEOs certainly have to be thinking about this to a degree. The C-suite and then the CHROs in particular, all of them really have to be start thinking about this age file.
And I appreciate your comparison also to climate risk, right? This is one of those issues where the cost of doing nothing compounds quietly in the background. And by the time it's obvious, it's very expensive to fix. So it's a great analogy there. And you also wrap this problem in a very vivid metaphor because gray is side A and gold is side B. So you write that gray is what happens when you're stuck in a habitual pattern, caught between the past and an unknown future. And then you later declare the future of work is gold. So, what in your mind does gray really represent? And tell me what gold represents in this context of modern work.
To keep me married, Charles, I write books, so I'm out of Denise's hair. And so, any of my book titles, this being the sixth, have some sort of hidden subliminal metaphor, some iconography, and certainly double entendres. And in this particular case, the future of work is gray has indeed that. And so, gray is, of course, meant to be two things. One is the society is aging, and I don't mean that in the sense that it's pro boomer. It's not. I'm not pro generations, as we'll get into probably. It is just that the math is saying that society is aging. So the average age of where we were in America in 1960 was in the early 30s, young kind of 32, and now it sits at 38, and it's getting older. So okay, that's math. So that's gray. But the second, of course, is that gray can mean fog. It can mean cloudy. So my future work is gray reference there is the double entendre. It's like, are you fogged over? And if you're fogged over, that means you're not thinking about this whole demography, longevity, wisdom loss, and ageism piece. And so, in my attempts to use my proclivity to be a famous DJ one day, I also thought, well, there are lots of books out there, as you know, that paint a picture of some crisis. It might be climate, it might be offshoring, outsourcing, whatever. It's just all about the pain. And I thought, yeah, you know what? Like maybe there's an antidote here. Maybe there's some way in which that I can help. And so, doing that research, I thought, well, the DJ, you always flip an album over, and maybe you could have like a whole different side B that is solution hopeful focus. And so the spoiler alert, of course, is I renamed the book halfway through. So side B, and ergo the book going forward, is called The Future Work is Gold. And gold to signify bright light, hope. These are solutions on the podium, and you get a gold medal if you kind of think these solutions through. So having a little bit of fun with my metaphors in this case, and the side B turning to hopeful solutions.
So, reflecting back on that mindset shift, gray is really then essentially the comfort of the familiar, even when the familiar no longer fits the world we're in. And maybe gold can be perceived then as that harder work of redesigning around experience and not fighting against it that I see so many leaders do. And to further unpack this gold mindset, your first reframe is a fairly big one because you don't like to talk about people with conventional generational labels. You push against that. So you've invented a new framework: the river, the rock, and the ruby. So, love for you to unpack that because I love what you say, and I love the choice of words here. You want to eviscerate most traditional age practices. Love that word, eviscerate. There's no denying what you are intending by that.
Dan is setting fire to many HR practices in this book. So it was also kind of a fun attempt to say, these are all the things that are keeping me up at night. And it just sort of also happened to be certainly aligned and coagulated to this age debt problem. So, um, where do I start? In the early 1960s, sort of, Ray Cattell came up with a theory, social psychologist, that there are two types of intelligence. And so the two types of intelligence, as he named, was fluid intelligence and crystallized intelligence. And that when you're young, you have a fluid intelligence, which is essentially you're learning, you can make mistakes, and you're the idea person. And then somewhere along the way, a switch flips, and then all of a sudden that fluidity turns into AKA crystallized intelligence. And thus the crystallized intelligence is this wisdom. And when you think about it, actually that's incorrect. It's not just a light flip switch, if you will. It's like, actually, here I am, in my mid 50s, and I'm in a particular era, but I started somewhere as well, not as Gen X. Just because I started working in 1995 as a Gen X doesn't mean I'm Gen X in the workplace. It means that, again, back to sort of the fluid intelligence idea, I was like, well, I was a river and I was flowing, and sometimes it would overflow and flood, and sometimes it would go divert over there and it would break off from the main river. If I look back at my career, I was figuring things out, but I was a leader at that time as well. And then I got better at being a leader. I got better at initiatives. I got better at projects. And I started looking back at my team members, my colleagues from academia, from SAP, from TELUS. I was like, huh. So I'm still always in a river, but maybe I've developed some rocks, and I planted those rocks to do a couple things, which is to prevent the river from being too fast. And now I'm sturdy and stoic with my rocks. And as a rock, again, whatever the age is, you could be 28, 38, 48, 58, it doesn't matter. I have developed these practices. And because of my river era and still ideating and still flowing, I, however, now have some solid ground. So, metaphorically, maybe I step on those rocks and I can sort of be above water, or whatever the rocks are doing. They are creating stability. Yeah. But then similarly, we do, each of us at some point in our careers, graduate to the third and final era, of which I call rubies. And the metaphor there is that over time, that river is coming up against your rocks that you have planted, more rocks plant over time. But because of your experience, your wisdom, certainly the knowledge that you have gained and are now sharing, that rock has crystallized into a ruby. And so again, I believe I'm in my Ruby era, in my mid 50s, writing books, doing consulting, retainers, gigs with a bunch of different clients, doing some keynotes, whatever. It's like I'm having the time of my life. If you look in organizations like the aforementioned BMW, so they actually instituted a program to essentially allow rubies to be rubies, meaning they call it the senior expert program. And if you're over the age of 50, you can put up your hand and let's say you're a director, VP, or whatever. You can say, "Hey, I don't want to be leading people anymore, but I'd like to still work here. Is it okay if I maybe become like an individual contributor and I can deliver Ruby wisdom?" And you have responsibilities and whatever. But they're like, BMW came up with this program so that they could keep their rubies, so they didn't discard them or terminate them, but they were now in a different role. And so imagine the wisdom from their fluid river era through their raw kind of leadership, senior leader era, and now they're in their ruby era as individual contributors helping younger rivers or rocks at BMW. I don't think it's helpful to say, "Oh, those millennials, the avocado toast eating people with their 8 water bottles." Like, that's unhelpful trope and meme calling inside an organization. What's more helpful is to say, we all go through these eras, and how do we become more cross generational? I can use that word, or intergenerational, in the thinking of composition and careering and et cetera between these 3 eras that each of us go through. Long winded, but yeah, it's definitely a bone I'm trying to pick here.
I like that reframe. So just to make sure I got it right, those rivers are really those early era contributors. They're free flowing, curious, almost infinitely energetic, but not yet grounded by midlife experience or refinement. Rocks are seen as those mid era professionals, custodians of the stone, more settled, more resilient, the ones others depend on for stability and strength while still having fluidity, creativity that's available. And then finally, the rubies are those later era contributors whose experience has been cut from weathered rock, polished over time into crystallized wisdom and experience and insight. And I like how you tie that into the rivers, the rocks, more to the fluid intelligence, and rubies to crystallized intelligence, citing that research says that fluid intelligence, it tends to peak earlier in our life, while crystallized intelligence grows and remains more and more potent with age, which is a great way to do that. And really, it challenges, like you said, those misconceptions of I'm just a Gen Xer or I'm just a millennial that doesn't really satisfy who you are and what value you can contribute to the organization or in your career.
You don't see too many, Charles, just to use one sports metaphor, but you don't see too many 20-year-old coaches of an MLB franchise or an NHL hockey team. In fact, you don't see any. Like, why would you in the organization have sort of that same analogous thinking that you're going to put a 20-year-old in charge as a VP of a unit that has 2,000 people or whatever you want? There is something to be said about those 3 eras, and that you do experience, make mistakes, have ideas, and learn. That you don't stop your fluidity in your rock or your ruby era, but your ideas are now crystallized in a way that says, "I'm looking in the rearview mirror as the 50-year-old, the 70-year-old, the 90-year-old. You know what? In 2008, here's what we did when the fiscal wall, a cliff collapse. Sorry, and this is what we did in that particular era for me when I was a rock. Maybe it'll help you in the 2026 version of that fiscal cliff." Like, you can't you can't tell me that a 20-year-old today can just go use AI and say, "What was it like during the 2008 fiscal cliff crisis with Fannie Mae, Mac, et cetera," and have that wisdom. That is earned over time. And that's what I'm getting at is instead of just calling them boomers and what you go through, that was my rocks era. Like, that 2008 stuff was real for me. Like, my experience, I had to get rid of $6 million and 10 people. That was real. I learned a lot, but now I can share that wisdom as to what it was like 18 years ago to go through it in a way that a 30-year-old today would not be able to, because that 30-year-old today obviously was 12.
Well, and you don't treat ageism as something that only hits rubies. You felt it on both ends for yourself. So I'd love for you to share your personal story because you've had experiences of being seen as too young early in your career and too old later in your career that's shaped how ageism actually is. So talk to us more about your personal experiences on both ends of that
Mm.
spectrum to help our listeners.
Well, I do appreciate this turning into a therapy session, Charles. So thank you for that. I will box of tissue right there just in case. So the first ages kind of experience I had, I was 25, 26. I was my first my first role at an academic institution which was called BCIT, still is British Columbia Institute of Technology. So it's a pretty highfalutin place in British Columbia. I moved from Quebec to take this role with my wife, and the premise was that there are three campuses at the time at BCIT, one at the airport for aviation, one downtown that they had just opened, which was an 8-floor spanking new downtown campus that was, generally speaking, empty. And then their traditional from the 1970s sprawling campus in a suburb of Vancouver called Burnaby. So I'm hired because I pitched the dean of computing and academic studies. Shout out to Dr. T, Ken Takagaki. He hired me to figure out some career changing programs for the downtown campus for adults. This is like me being 25 or 26. I was like, this is great. What an opportunity. Now, I'm a couple weeks into the gig, and the first all faculty and staff meeting is happening for this computing and academic studies unit. There are two types of washrooms. There are student washrooms, and then there's staff and faculty washrooms. So before the meeting started, I went to the loo, and as I went into the faculty and staff one, because I was 2 weeks into my gig, Charles, faculty and staff. I had a lanyard. It said staff. There's a gentleman there. He's older than me, I'll say, but you might argue he was probably at the time 30-ish years older than me. And so he's washing his hands, and I'm walking in. He looks at me. He's like, "Son, this is the staff and faculty washroom." I was like, "I know." I'm like, "And what's your point?" And I said, I held up my lanyard. I said, "I work here." And he looked at me and he gave me the sort of one over. And he's like, "Huh, I didn't know we were hiring people so young. What a shame." He walks out. And thankfully, he wasn't in that faculty that I worked in, but I found out where he did work, by the way. And I was just stunned. Now, it's haunted me because obviously I tell this story in the book, and for a long, long time I didn't actually realize it was ageism. I just thought he was a jerk, which is you might call it reverse ageism, but it is ageism, and it happened to me as a 25, 26 year old, and it stuck with me, and it hurt. I started to think about all the different examples then at the River Rock and Ruby era levels where there is a significant amount of ageism happening for young people these days whom are overlooked, and they're told that they won't cut it because of their age. They're too young. They're going to be replaced by AI. Don't even bother, right? Just these very mental anguish type quips that stick with you. And when you're a river and young and impressionable, but also nervous about your stature, your sense of purpose and meaning, like it can seriously be a drag and cause some psychological kind of unsafe thinking in your head. So that's my younger version. Fast forward 30 years ish, and it's the fall of 2022. So I just turned 50, and I got a form letter email from one of the speaker bureaus that I'm a part of. And basically, Charles, it went like this. It went, "Dear Dan, thanks for your service. We're making some changes to our speaker roster, and we're no longer needing your service." I was like, "Form letter? Also, I've been working with you for like a decade and done a bunch of gigs really well, and I've seen feedback. Like, what the hell is happening here?" So, me being Dan, I reach out to said speaker bureau president, and the response I got was, quote, "Well, Dan, we're refreshing the roster." And again, gobsmacked, flabbergasted. And I'm thinking, refreshing the roster. So the follow up, of course, was, "So too many middle aged men, and the lack of response sort of told me the answer. And that one hurt too. I'm not gonna lie, which also finds its home, that story, in the book, because here I am, basically 30 years apart, with a story of how it affected me as a young impressionable River, but also an older Ruby. And you know, I'm a human, and it hurt, both of them. And I just wanted to share those personal experiences because I'll tell you, Charles, like I am getting 4 or 5 of these a week from people unsolicited telling me of their River Rock or Ruby ageism.
When it reinforces your point that all three personas are vulnerable. Rivers can be dismissed as not ready, rocks can feel like they're stuck, and rubies as expired. All three are just different forms or different flavors of that same bias.
They are, and they all hurt. Like, and if you ask a River, a Rock, or Ruby their experiences with ageism, I have story after story of these individuals. So, I mean, um, another one where an individual has been trying, a Ruby, sorry, has been trying and trying and trying, has sent out 168 applications, and they keep coming back with overqualified or don't have the right experience, oddly and weirdly. And these people are struggling with this massive amount of experience. And they're just saying, I just like to work. I like to find this purpose back again. And they're being sort of age ridiculed or age shunned.
Well, let's stay on side A and let's talk about rubies because I think this is a real critical issue. And you bring it to mind through a great example in the book. You're in Japan on a taxi ride, and it's a highly capable ruby driving a taxi in Japan. And love for you to expand that and talk about broke rubies, the global retirement savings gap, and what happens when rubies are forced to continue working in jobs that they were never intended to do at that age.
Before that, here in America, if you look at the data from those that are between the ages of 50 and 64, it should frighten you, because the median of a 50 to 64-year-old in America is $71,000 for retirement. The average is 141. So you're like 50 to 64, which you're supposed to be freedom 55ing or retire at 60, and the median is 71. And if you're going to live longer, Charles, how on earth, 401k or Social Security aside, are you possibly going to live off of 71k if you're 60 years old right now? So I decide to do some reconnaissance in Japan. So I went to Japan, went to South Korea, a bunch of trips to Europe, including Germany. I think I was most taken aback positively and negatively with Japan. I'd never been to Japan, but I knew that having worked with folks in doing interviews, that I just had to go and insert myself into that country. And so I spent 11 days in Tokyo, Osaka, and Hiroshima. And I'll tell you, first of all, when you insert yourself into three types of workers, conversation. So I met with a bunch of economists, like the chief economist of the Bank of Japan, for example. And then I met with a bunch of academics who are in the demography kind of era, line of thinking. And then I met with line leaders, like executives in HR and manufacturing and Toyota, Mitsubishi. I will explain Haruki because Haruki was my first Japanese experience. So you fly into the airport, you take the bullet train to the main train station in Tokyo, and then from there it's like a 10, 12-minute cab ride to where my hotel was. So I get in the taxi line, the queue, and I get in this taxi and in the back, it's kind of like, it was dark, but I could see this gentleman in the front seat there, and I could see his left side of his face just very wrinkled. And he's got these white gloves, got this white shirt. We're driving along. And I'm like just fascinated by this gentleman who's clearly older than me. And I'm wondering, look, why is he driving this taxi? Like, what's going on? So I try to strike up this conversation, his broken English and my zero Japanese. And so it turns out that Haruki was an engineer. And he had been an engineer his entire life. Japan has, or had, and they're sort of in the transition, forced retirement at the age of 60. And then he did a couple years, it turns out, like back with the organization that he worked for. I was like, "Hey, Haruki, do you mind me asking you, how old are you?" And he was happy. And he's like, 74. It's like 74. I'm curious. Right now I'm like, okay, I'm in research mode for this book. And this is like story number one, I guess. And I'm like, okay, Haruki, so you're an engineer, you're 74. How long you been driving this taxi for? I think he said 5 years, might have been 6, but 5 years. I was like, okay. So like, why are you driving this taxi? And then I'll never forget it because he's like, three things. It says people, boredom, money. And the penny drop, like maybe that's a bad pun, but the penny drop for me there, I was like, oh, so you're lonely, I guess, boredom, that whole people boredom thing, but the money bit, that then stuck with me because now I'm lined up in Tokyo the next day meeting a couple academics, economists later on in the week. And I'm thinking, this is a real life example of someone whom had this career, is 74, knew when he was 69 or 68 that he was going to run out of money. So he's now and bored and lonely. And so he's driving a cab. I don't know how long he's going to drive the cab for, but this guy's definitely living long. He looks fit, lean, and he's humming, but he definitely needs to drive that cab in order to make ends meet.
Well, and that's kind of what you mentioned is really a kind of a double loss, right? Is that not only is he forced to work because of his age and he's kind of pushed into low status work, often physically demanding roles that neither use their deep experience nor provide dignity for rubies. But on the other hand, organizations and societies waste an untapped reservoir of crystallized intelligence by not designing roles, pathways, or supports that would let rubies contribute at their highest level. And we're all moving through these errors. Every one of us is a river who became a rock who will one day become a ruby. The organizations that win in the future won't be the ones chasing the next shiny demographic or the next hero leader. They're going to be the ones who learn to keep the rivers, rocks, and rubies on stage together long after any single hit. Thank you for listening to this episode of the Good Leadership Podcast. Remember, great ideas only matter when they change what you do next. So choose one insight from today's conversation and put it into practice this week. If this episode was valuable, follow the show and share it with someone who would benefit. And until next time, remember, the edge belongs to those who outlearned what worked yesterday, who can outthink what's coming next so that they can outperform when it counts.